In this episode, we're going to walk through the software development lifecycle, SDLC, as if it's a real journey a system takes from idea to retirement, and we'll keep security and privacy in the story the whole way instead of tacking them on at the end. The Certified in Governance, Risk, and Compliance, CG perspective is that security and privacy work best when they are built into decisions early, because late fixes are expensive, disruptive, and sometimes impossible to do well. Beginners often hear SDLC and think it's a technical thing only developers care about, but governance, risk, and compliance show up at every stage because every stage creates commitments. Those commitments can be about what data you collect, what promises you make to customers, what risks you accept, and what evidence you will later need to prove you did things responsibly. When you integrate security and privacy into the SDLC, you don't just reduce vulnerabilities, you also reduce surprises, because you define scope, requirements, and accountability before the system becomes a tangled web of assumptions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The SDLC is essentially a structured way to build and maintain software or systems, usually described as a series of stages like planning, requirements, design, development, testing, deployment, operations, and retirement. Not every organization uses the same labels, and some approaches are more iterative than linear, but the fundamental idea is consistent. You start with an idea, you turn it into a design, you build it, you validate it, you launch it, you operate it, and eventually you change it or retire it. Security and privacy integration means you ask the right questions in each stage, and you make decisions that are traceable and defensible. This is where governance matters because governance defines what success means, what obligations apply, and who has authority to approve risk decisions. Risk management matters because you need to evaluate uncertainty, threats, and impacts as the system evolves. Compliance matters because requirements are not satisfied by intention. They are satisfied by documented controls and evidence that those controls operate. A system built without this integration often becomes a compliance scramble later, where teams try to retrofit documentation and controls to match reality after the fact. The planning stage is where integration begins, because planning is where you decide why the system exists and what it is supposed to do. Security and privacy questions in planning are not about tools. They're about boundaries and expectations. You want to know what kind of data the system will handle, especially whether it will process personal data or sensitive business data. You also want to know who will use the system, where it will be used, and what failure would mean, because those factors shape risk severity. Planning is also the stage where governance can set non-negotiables, like compliance mandates, privacy principles, and baseline security expectations. If you skip these conversations, the project may quietly build toward an architecture that cannot meet requirements without major rework. A beginner-friendly way to see planning is that it's the moment where you either decide to build a safe house or you decide to build a pretty house and hope storms don't come. The purpose of integration is to make that choice deliberate, not accidental. Requirements gathering is the stage where integration becomes specific, because this is where you translate objectives into measurable expectations. Functional requirements describe what the system must do, like process transactions or display information, while non-functional requirements describe qualities like performance, reliability, security, and privacy. Security requirements might include access control expectations, logging needs, and resilience goals, while privacy requirements might include data minimization, consent expectations, retention limits, and transparency about data use. A common beginner mistake is to treat security and privacy requirements as optional add-ons, but they are just as real as the requirement that the system must work. Requirements also create the foundation for testing and evidence later, because you cannot validate what you never defined. Governance supports requirements by establishing who can approve them, how conflicts are resolved, and how changes are controlled. When security and privacy requirements are clear early, the rest of the SDLC becomes a process of meeting them rather than a series of late-stage debates. Design is where you decide how the system will meet requirements, and it is one of the highest leverage stages for security and privacy. Decisions about architecture, data flow, trust boundaries, and interfaces can either reduce risk naturally or create risk that is difficult to control later. Security integration in design includes thinking about least privilege, segmentation, secure data storage and transmission, and how authentication and authorization will work at a conceptual level. Privacy integration includes limiting data collection to what is necessary, separating identifiers when possible, and designing workflows that respect user expectations and legal obligations. Design is also where you can plan for secure logging and monitoring without collecting unnecessary personal data, which is a common intersection point between security and privacy. A strong design stage also considers misuse cases, meaning ways the system could be abused or fail, because understanding failure modes helps choose controls intelligently. For a beginner, the key takeaway is that good design makes later security work easier and cheaper, while poor design makes every later stage feel like damage control. Development is where code and configuration are created, and integration here means building with security and privacy in mind rather than writing everything first and hoping testing will catch problems. You don't need to imagine developers typing commands to understand the governance perspective. The point is that development should follow standards and practices that reduce common weaknesses. That includes using approved components, avoiding insecure shortcuts, and ensuring sensitive data is handled correctly. Privacy integration during development includes implementing consent logic properly, ensuring data is stored and shared according to defined purposes, and avoiding hidden data collection that was not approved. Development is also where secure defaults matter, because systems often launch with default settings that become permanent habits. Governance and compliance show up here through secure coding standards, code review expectations, and documentation practices that create traceable evidence. If a control requires peer review or approval, development processes must make that normal. When integration is strong, security and privacy are part of the definition of done, not a separate checklist. Testing is where many beginners expect security to happen, but in a mature SDLC, it is more accurate to say testing validates what has already been built with security and privacy in mind. Testing includes functional testing, but for security and privacy integration, it also includes validating access control logic, validating that sensitive data is protected appropriately, and validating that logging and monitoring behave as expected. Privacy testing includes validating that data is collected only when appropriate, that users can exercise required rights if applicable, and that retention and deletion behaviors align with policy. Testing is also where you can check whether controls are effective, not just present, because a control that exists but fails under real conditions is not a meaningful control. From a compliance perspective, testing produces evidence, because test results, approvals, and remediation actions can demonstrate that the organization took reasonable steps. The key is that testing must be planned based on requirements, not improvised, because improvised testing tends to miss important cases. When you treat testing as evidence generation, you naturally become more disciplined about what you test and what you record. Deployment is the stage where the system moves into a real environment where it can affect real people and real business operations. Security integration at deployment includes ensuring the system is released with approved configurations, that access is granted appropriately, and that monitoring is in place from day one. Privacy integration includes ensuring that data sharing pathways are correct, that user notices or consent mechanisms are accurate, and that data handling behaviors match what was approved in requirements and design. Deployment is also where change control and approvals matter, because launching a system is a risk decision, and governance should define who can accept that risk. Many organizations also require a go-live review where security and privacy readiness is confirmed, which supports integrity by preventing silent launch of non-compliant systems. For beginners, it helps to see deployment as the moment the organization publicly commits to the system's behavior. If you deploy without integration, you may accidentally commit to harmful or non-compliant behaviors that are painful to unwind. Integration makes deployment a controlled event rather than a leap of faith. Operations is where systems live most of their life, and it is where security and privacy integration becomes continuous. Security operations include monitoring, incident response readiness, patching and maintenance decisions, and periodic review of access and configuration. Privacy operations include managing data subject requests where applicable, enforcing retention and deletion schedules, and ensuring data sharing remains within approved purposes. Governance is critical in operations because operations is where drift happens. People add accounts, make quick changes, and create exceptions that accumulate over time. A mature program has cadences for reviews, clear processes for exceptions, and measurement to detect when controls are weakening. Operations also creates the richest evidence set because logs, review records, incident reports, and maintenance records all demonstrate whether controls are operating. A beginner misconception is that compliance is something you do for an audit, but in reality, operations is where compliance is lived. When operations is disciplined, audits become a confirmation rather than a crisis. Change management is part of operations, but deserves special attention because changes are where risk often spikes. A system might be secure at launch, but a small change can introduce new data flows, new dependencies, or new access paths that were never evaluated. Security integration and change management means assessing the risk of changes, ensuring approvals are appropriate, and validating that controls remain effective after changes. Privacy integration means reevaluating whether the change alters what personal data is collected or how it is used, because that can trigger new obligations or require updated notices. A common beginner trap is to think that only major changes matter, but a series of minor changes can transform a system over time. Governance provides the rules for how changes are evaluated and who can approve them. When change management is strong, the organization avoids the slow creep into non-compliance and unexpected exposure. This is one of the most practical places where CGRC thinking prevents long-term surprises. Eventually, every system reaches a retirement stage, even if it's just being replaced or merged into something else. Retirement is often ignored in beginner discussions, but it is critical for security and privacy because it is where data and access can linger dangerously. Security integration in retirement includes ensuring accounts are removed, credentials are revoked, and system components are decommissioned cleanly. Privacy integration includes ensuring data is retained only as long as required, disposed of properly when no longer needed, and transferred carefully if there is a legitimate purpose for migration. Retirement also includes preserving required records for compliance, which is a subtle but important point. You may need to keep certain logs, approvals, or evidence even after the system itself is gone. Governance should define retention obligations and ensure someone owns the retirement process, because abandoned systems are a classic source of hidden risk. Beginners often imagine retirement as flipping a switch, but in practice, it is a controlled process with approvals, evidence, and verification. A mature organization treats retirement as part of system lifecycle integrity, not as an afterthought. A final concept that ties the whole SDLC together is traceability, meaning you can connect objectives to requirements, requirements to design, design to implementation, and implementation to evidence. Traceability is not a fancy extra. It is how you prove that the system was built deliberately and responsibly. In security and privacy governance, traceability supports accountability because it shows who approved decisions and why. It supports risk management because it shows where controls address risks and where gaps remain. It supports compliance because it provides a narrative that auditors and assessors can follow without guessing. Beginners often think traceability requires endless documentation, but it can be simple as long as it is consistent. A requirement points to a control points to evidence, and evidence is produced as part of normal work. When traceability exists, you can answer questions like why do we do this and how do we know it works? That ability is the heartbeat of CGRC-aligned program. As we close, walking the SDLC with security and privacy integrated is really about making good decisions early and keeping them alive through the system's entire life. Planning sets purpose and boundaries, requirements translate intent into measurable expectations, design builds in risk reduction, development implements responsibly, testing validates and produces evidence, deployment commits the organization to controlled behavior, operations maintains discipline over time, change management prevents drift, and retirement removes lingering risk and manages data responsibly. Each stage has a different kind of decision, but governance, risk management, and compliance show up in all of them because each stage creates obligations and evidence. If you keep the mental habit of asking what is required, what is risky, who owns the decision, and what proof will exist, you will naturally integrate security and privacy without needing to memorize 1,000 details. That habit is what the CGRC exam is trying to measure, and it is also what real organizations need to stay trustworthy as systems evolve. When integration becomes routine, security and privacy stop being last-minute emergencies and become normal parts of building systems that deserve trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.